Welcome back to Behind the Genius, where forgotten history reveals its darkest shadows. Tonight, we board a train that should have been ordinary, but became something else entirely. In 1926, a passenger train left Helena, Montana, on a cold winter night. It arrived in Billings on schedule. No wreck, no missing cars, no delay. And yet, every single passenger swore the same impossible story. The train had stopped in the middle of nowhere. The lamps went dark, and a woman's voice whispered from the shadows. 55 years later, in 1981, history repeated itself. A commemorative ride crossed the same gorge, and once again dozens of passengers, strangers, to one another reported the exact same words, spoken in the exact same voice. This is the story of the lost train of Montana and the voice that refuses to be silenced. The lost train of Montana leaves us with questions that may never find answers. Was it a haunting, a warning, or something far older than the tracks themselves? Every account ends the same, with a voice that still refuses to be silenced. If stories like this keep you searching for the truth, make sure you subscribe to Behind the Genius. Your support not only ensures you never miss these forgotten histories, but it also motivates me to keep uncovering them and uploading more episodes. Every subscription tells me this journey matters and drives me to go even deeper into the mysteries others would rather leave behind. Share this with someone who thinks trains only carry passengers and not voices. And let us know in the comments, what do you think that whisper was truly warning against? Until next time, keep questioning, keep listening, and never stop looking deeper. Behind the Genius. It was January 16, 1926, when the evening train rolled out of Helena, Montana. The town was wrapped in snow, the streets darkened by the early winter night, and the sound of the locomotive's whistle carried across the valley like a call to the unknown. This was Northern Pacific number 247, a mid-size passenger train bound east for Billings. Its wheels grinding against iron rails that gleamed under the cold moonlight. To the passengers, it was just another journey. A collection of salesmen, miners, families, and drifters huddled together in the warmth of the cars. None of them knew that their ride would become one of the strangest episodes in American railway history. The manifest recorded 83 passengers aboard, plus a crew of 7. Among them was a traveling schoolteacher, a widowed cattle rancher with 2 young sons, and a group of 5 men headed to Billings for work in the rail yards. The train had no prestige, no luxury sleepers, just the bare essentials of travel in an unforgiving winter. Yet what happened that night would echo in whispers through Montana folklore for decades to come. As the train left the station, Helena shrank into darkness behind them, the lamps of the depot flickering until they were swallowed by the snow and distance. The passengers settled in, conversations grew quiet, coats were hung on hooks, and the rhythmic clatter of wheels against tracks lulled many into uneasy sleep. Outside, the night deepened, the Bitterroot Range looming black against a sky veined with cloud. The route was familiar. The train would cross the Missouri River, wind through valleys, and cut into the Livingston Gorge before pushing on toward Billings. But something changed once they reached that gorge. According to multiple passenger accounts preserved in interviews and letters, the first sign came when the lamps flickered. A few passengers thought nothing of it. Electricity was still prone to failure on older trains. But then the train itself slowed. The whistle blew once, long and low, as if in warning. Some said it was almost mournful, stretched out far longer than usual. Then the brakes screamed, and the cars lurched to a halt in the middle of the gorge, an area where no scheduled stop existed, where the tracks were cut directly through sheer walls of stone. The silence that followed was unnatural. No engine huff, no conductor's voice calling out, just the hiss of snow falling on metal and the creak of wood as the cars shifted slightly against the stillness. Passengers leaned to the windows, peering into the dark canyon, but saw nothing but snow swirling in the beam of the headlamp. That's when the lamps went out. All along the train, the interior plunged into black. Children began to cry. Adults murmured nervously, and footsteps echoed, as a conductor tried to make his way down the aisle with a lantern. But before he reached the middle car, every single passenger reported the same thing. A woman's voice. It was not loud, not Shouted, but it carried, clear, steady, and chillingly close, as though she were standing just behind their shoulders. "Not yet," she said. "Not for you." Some passengers described it as a whisper, others as a low murmur, but the words were always identical. Even those who claimed they had been dozing were jarred awake and repeated the same phrase in interviews years later. For 30 full seconds the train was frozen, silent except for the breathing of dozens of people too afraid to speak. Then, without explanation, the lamps flickered back on, the engine roared, and the train jolted forward. When they arrived in Billings 2 hours later, everything appeared normal. The crew swore the train had not stopped. The engineers insisted they had never lost power. Their logs showed a perfect, uninterrupted run. But 83 passengers disagreed, and none of them ever forgot the voice that spoke in the gorge that night. The Billings Gazette ran the story under a modest headline: "Passengers report strange stop in Livingston Gorge." At the time, it was treated as a curiosity, a collective illusion born of fatigue and cold. But diaries kept by at least a dozen riders, preserved in historical archives, all describe the same unnerving event. Identical words, identical timing, identical terror. That was the beginning of the mystery of the lost train. The morning after the train reached Billings, the town was buzzing. It wasn't often that an ordinary passenger run made the front page of the Gazette, but by the time daylight broke, at least a dozen passengers had already sought out the newspaper office to share what they had experienced. At first the editor thought it was a prank. Too many people, he reasoned, had been riding in the same confined space, perhaps. They'd all spooked one another into believing they'd heard something. But as he interviewed them one by one, something troubling emerged. They were all describing the exact same words: "Not yet, not for you." The phrasing never changed, no matter the age, background, or seat assignment of the passenger. A schoolteacher named Clara Jennings swore the voice had come from directly over her shoulder. It wasn't shouted, she insisted. It was like someone bending down and whispering close to your ear. I turned. I thought surely one of the men near me was playing a cruel trick, but no lips were moving, no faces had changed. Yet every person near me stiffened, all at the same time. Another account from a cattleman named Henry M.C. Graw was nearly identical. He had been traveling with his 2 sons, ages 9 and 11. The boys began to cry when the lamps went out, but Henry said it wasn't the dark that frightened them. It was that they both covered their ears at the same moment. They didn't want to hear it, he told the Gazette reporter. They said it was too close, too cold, too wrong. Yet when questioned, the crew gave an entirely different story. Conductor John Whitfield insisted that there had been no stop at all. The engine never lost power. The brakes were never engaged, he said. We were on time. We arrived on time. If there had been any delay, even a few minutes, I'd have marked it. The engineer, a grizzled veteran named Samuel Burns, gave an even sharper reply. "Folks can tell ghost stories if they like. My locomotive never stopped, not once. They dreamed it." And yet, there was no mistaking the conviction in the passengers' voices. They weren't inventing this. Too many of them were strangers from different towns, with no reason to concoct the same story. Their accounts even included the same physical detail: a sudden chill sweeping through the cars, as though all the warmth had been pulled out in one sharp breath. Weeks later, more letters arrived at the Gazette, one from a businessman in Livingston, who hadn't come forward earlier because he feared being ridiculed. He wrote that he distinctly remembered his pocket watch stopping at the very moment the voice spoke. "It was 10:37 by my hand," he noted. "The watch restarted on its own as the lamps came back, and I've never known it to lose a second otherwise." Another passenger, a seamstress named Eleanor Pike, described something else. She said she saw, just for an instant, a figure moving down the aisle, but only when the lamps were out. A tall silhouette of a woman in what looked like a heavy traveling cloak. "I thought it must be a trick of my eyes," she admitted, but when the lights returned, the aisle was empty. Still, the moment the voice spoke, I would have sworn she was there. By February, the story had spread beyond Montana. Paranormal researchers of the era, mostly amateur collectors of ghost tales, began writing letters to Billings, asking for first-hand accounts. But there was no satisfying explanation. No body found along the tracks, no missing passenger, No clue of a woman boarding or leaving the train. It was as if the voice had materialized out of the very air. One chilling fact tied the reports together, the words, "Not yet, not for you." What did it mean? Why would every passenger, without exception, remember those exact 5 words? And why would the crew, supposedly just as present, claim to have heard nothing at all? Some suggested the voice was a warning, that perhaps the gorge was unstable and the train had been spared a collapse. Others whispered it was a curse, that the voice was claiming the passengers for some later time. A minister in Billings even delivered a sermon about it, warning his congregation that the devil himself could delay death to ensnare souls later. For the passengers themselves, though, the effect was far more personal. Many never rode that line again. At least 4 wrote in diaries, later preserved in archives, that they had nightmares for years afterward. One man claimed he never traveled by train again, saying that the sound of any whistle set his heart racing with dread. And yet, the phenomenon might have faded into folklore, a single strange night on a Montana train, had it not been for what happened 55 years later. Because in 1981, on the very same stretch of track, history repeated itself. 55 years passed. The year was 1981, and the world had changed. Diesel engines had long since replaced the old coal-burning locomotives. Color televisions filled living rooms. The Cold War loomed. And yet, one winter night, as Amtrak's North Coast Limited rolled east through Montana, the past came roaring back, unchanged, unaged, and utterly unexplainable. It was late January when the train left Helena, bound for Billings. Snow still blanketed the valleys, just as it had in 1926, and the tracks still curved. Through the Livingston Gorge, the same corridor of rock where the earlier incident had occurred. Most passengers that night were oblivious to the story of the lost train. For them it was a routine journey, college students heading home, families visiting relatives, businessmen traveling for work. At approximately 10:40 p.m., just as the train entered the gorge, something happened that would later shock investigators, historians, and even surviving witnesses of the first event. The train slowed, not dramatically, just enough for passengers to notice the change in rhythm. The wheels' steady clatter against the rails faltered, stretched, as though time itself had hiccuped. Some passengers leaned toward the windows, confused by the sight of the headlamp beams stalling against the rock walls. A few assumed there was debris on the tracks. Then, as before, the lamps flickered. One college student, a young woman named Carol Anders, later, told journalists she felt her ears pop, as if a sudden pressure had sucked the air from the car. Others recalled the silence, a heavy, unnatural silence, pressing down on them until even the children grew still. And then it came. The voice, clear, steady, and impossibly close. "Not yet, not for you." Every passenger who spoke publicly about the incident used the exact same words. A man named Robert Klein, a traveling insurance adjuster, swore the voice came from inside his seatback, as though the words were vibrating through the very fabric of the train. Another, an elderly woman, insisted it sounded exactly like her late sister, a voice she had not heard in 20 years. Within seconds, the lamps returned to full brightness. The train jolted forward, regaining its steady speed. But when passengers reached Billings, they were shaken, pale, and utterly convinced something supernatural had just unfolded. And once again, the crew denied everything. According to the engineer's log, there had been no slowdown, no power failure, no deviation in schedule. The train never lost so much as a minute, one conductor said. They dreamed it. But history was repeating itself in eerie detail. When researchers compared the testimonies from 1926 and 1981, the similarities were chilling. Both incidents occurred in January, both at approximately 10:37 to 10:40 p.m., both inside Livingston Gorge. Both involved lamps flickering, silence, and the same exact phrase, "Not yet, not for you." In both cases, passengers described the sensation of a sudden chill or shift in air pressure. Even more unsettling was the discovery that several passengers from 1981 had no knowledge of the original story. The Gazette archives were old, yellowed, and largely forgotten, The lost train of 1926 was not a common tale. These were ordinary travelers, and yet their words echoed those of witnesses. From half a century before the story made national headlines. Paranormal investigators descended on Montana, camping near the gorge, hoping to hear the voice themselves. Amtrak was forced to issue a public statement, assuring travelers the line was safe. Skeptics called it mass hysteria, a psychological contagion that somehow repeated itself decades apart. But believers whispered darker theories, that the gorge was cursed, that a woman's spirit lingered there, forever bound to the iron rails. And yet one mystery remained. Why not yet? After the 1981 recurrence, the story of the lost train spread far beyond Montana. National newspapers picked it up, television crews came to Billings, and for a time, the Livingston Gorge was treated less like a railway corridor and more like a stage for the supernatural. Investigators arrived in waves. Paranormal societies set up crude recording devices near the tracks, waiting through freezing January nights for a whisper that never returned. Some brought electromagnetic detectors, claiming unusual spikes near the gorge walls. Local historians combed through archives, searching for any event in 1926 that might explain it. A crash, a missing passenger, a tragedy buried in railroad records. But they found nothing. No deaths, no disappearances, no woman in a traveling cloak who should have been there and wasn't. Skeptics had their own explanations. Psychologists argued that passengers had experienced collective suggestion, a shared hallucination brought on by darkness, isolation, and the rhythm of the train. Physicists speculated that unusual echoes in the gorge might distort sounds of the train itself into what resembled a human voice, and railroad engineers insisted that flickering lamps could easily result from power surges in older electrical systems, creating the perfect storm for frightened minds. But none of those theories explained the most haunting detail. The words were always the same. Not yet, not for you, not a jumble of phrases, not scattered sounds mistaken for speech, but 5 clear words, repeated in 1926 and again in 1981. Some believers leaned into folklore. They spoke of the banshee, a spirit said to warn the living of deaths not yet come. Others tied it to Native American legends of echo spirits, voices said to linger in the stone, repeating messages across generations. A few even whispered that the gorge itself was cursed, its rock holding memories, like a phonograph record, replaying a warning to those who crossed it. The strangest theory came from a retired priest in Helena. He claimed the voice wasn't a ghost at all, but a messenger. A warning, yes, but one that suggested the passengers were spared from a fate they couldn't see. Not yet, he explained in a radio interview, means death was near, but not that night, not for those aboard. For the people of Montana, the theories mattered less than the unease. Train whistles echoing through the gorge at night carried a new weight, a new dread. Some residents refused to ride the line entirely. Others left offerings, coins, flowers, even notes, near the tracks, as if appeasing whatever spirit dwelled there. And though the voice was never officially recorded again, both 1926 and 1981 linger like twin shadows. 2 moments separated by 55 years, joined by 5 words no one can explain. In the decades that followed 1981, the lost train of Montana slipped quietly back into folklore. It was no longer front-page news, but the story endured, whispered in train stations, told around campfires, passed from old-timers to children as a warning about the gorge. Amtrak quietly avoided scheduling commemorative rides through Livingston in January. Conductors traded nervous jokes about not working the cursed shift. And yet, every winter, rumors surfaced, a passenger who swore the lights dimmed, a crewman who thought he heard a woman breathing just behind his ear. None of these accounts ever matched the magnitude of 1926 or 1981, but they added fuel to the fire, enough to keep the legend alive. For survivors of both events, the story was far more personal. Several passengers from 1981 reported near-death experiences in the years that followed. Car crashes they barely survived, sudden illnesses that almost claimed them, disasters they narrowly escaped. Each one, when interviewed, admitted they remembered those words echoing in their heads. Not yet. Not for you. It was as though the voice had spoken not just to the train, but to each of them individually. A reminder that their time would come, but that night, on those rails, they had been spared. And so, the lost train became less about locomotives and timetables, and more about fate, about destiny, about the idea that something unseen travels with us, and sometimes speaks, if only to tell us our story isn't finished. Today, the Livingston Gorge remains as it always has been, sheer walls of stone, echoing with the rumble of freight trains and the howl of winter winds. Most riders pass through without incident, but for those who know the story, every flicker of a cabin light, every sudden hush of the cars, carries a weight that cannot be ignored. The lost train has become more than a tale of the supernatural. It is a question, unanswered, lingering like the voice itself. What did not yet mean? Was it the whisper of a restless spirit, a message carved into time, or something far older than human memory? And perhaps the most unsettling thought of all is this: if the warning has already sounded twice, exactly 55 years apart, then what happens when that interval comes due again? By that measure, the next reckoning falls not in the past, but in our future. So the question is no longer whether the voice will return, it is who will be there to hear it. And so the mystery of Montana's lost train lingers, a story written not on timetables or in railway logs, but whispered in the dark, carved into memory, and carried forward by those who heard the impossible. Twice in 55 years, the same voice spoke, delivering the same warning. If history repeats itself, then perhaps the most terrifying chapter has yet to be written. What do you think? Was the voice a trick of sound, a mass hallucination, or something reaching across time to spare the living? And when the next interval arrives, will it call again? If you enjoyed uncovering this forgotten piece of history, make sure you subscribe. Your support motivates me to keep digging into these strange and unsettling stories, and it's the reason I can keep bringing more of them to you. Every subscription is fuel for the next investigation, the next mystery, the next journey into the shadows. So subscribe now, and together, let's keep searching, because the past has not finished speaking.